Welcome back to Linux Prepper Podcast. Please enjoy this bonus episode on a great year in Linux. HB and I will deep dive into containers, things like Docker, specifically who are they for and who are they not for. So if you're a home enthusiast thinking about containers, and now you can enjoy that talk. And if you have any thoughts, please do send them in to the show, podcast@livingcartoon.org, or you can join discuss.james.network. I want to give a little precursor for this because you should understand if you're interested in containers, then you are someone who is interested in self-hosting your own services, be it at home or otherwise. Maybe you already do. That's great. And you're curious how containers may help your existing setup. So if that's the case, this episode was made for you. And we're focusing on Docker, which is just an industry standard thing, but it applies what we're talking about with containers and turning those containers and run commands into a compose file structure. This can be applied to Podman or any other iteration of container virtualization type technologies. So who this is for the self-hosters and the DIYers. Anyone running a service and they want to understand how containers could apply to them. What this talk will not teach you, which you must understand in terms of running services in general, but also containers, is file system structure, how to have proper backups, and most importantly, how to manage file permissions. Because whether you're in a container or not, at some point you will need to have a very just basic, solid understanding of permissions and how they apply to yourself as well as any other user using your services or however you choose to run your system. So that said, if you're running your own services and you're curious about how containers might help you, what basic containers are, what compose files are, or examples of how these can apply and scale across numbers of different services, because that's where it gets really exciting. And please do send in your feedback, podcast@livingcartoon.org, and share this if you find it useful. Really, really hope it gives you a nice back and forth discussion take on how containers could be applicable to you. And we'll also have links to the Lemmy discussions where we asked users not interested in containers about why that is. So yeah, thanks so much for listening and enjoy. Ameridroid.com is a sponsor of LinuxPrepper Podcast. They are the US-based distributor of single-board computers and home automation products for companies like Hardkernel, who produce Odroid and other single-board computers. It saves you the hassle of having to order overseas, and you also have friendly customer service. Call them on the phone. They have global shipping options, and we are proud to have them sponsor the show. You can use LinuxPrepper at checkout, or I'll include some links to some of my favorite products. A big thank you to Ameridroid.com. So what are containers and what do they do? Containers are just, giving you a reproducible build of the whole software package. And it's making it so you can define what is ephemeral and what actually lives on the file system. What lives on the file system is called mounts. It's been called volumes. And you're setting locations on the file system where data actually lives. And then everything else is just ephemeral and can come and go, like the software that you don't really care about that's running the actual service that you'll, replace or update or whatever. And it's a really useful way to set something up and also blow it away at a moment's notice and replace it while having the exact directory of data you want to continue to live where you expect them to be accessed. I asked HB for an example. Tell me about your text adventure game.
Yeah, so this text adventure game, which is called Mermaids, A Secret Journey, was inspired actually by my daughter. So we've been working on it for a little while, but basically she had these sketches that she made for me. And as you know, James, I've been doing ANSI art for a long time. I fired up DirDraw, which is a great editor, but it does a lot more than that. So I've been drawing up the scenes for that with DirDraw. And I actually had a MagPi Magazine. If you guys aren't familiar with that, that's a Raspberry Pi magazine. 2017, man, pretty old. And, I was looking through it and there's this text adventure guide, it's pretty minimal one. What I have now is much more advanced. It just kind of, reminded me of the fact that I wanted to do that. And I went ahead and got started on it. I'm actually done with the first level. There's still some things that I got to figure out, but it worked really well. I'm going to migrate to a different shell system because actually I'm able to do TTYD. I don't know if folks are familiar with that. I couldn't really adjust too much. So with TTYD, at least I was able to get a basic web server, kind of like a wrapper to help the shell run like a normal game. So now it's centered in the screen. It's a lot larger. The art is, populating correctly. I've got that in a Docker container. And, I find it pretty ideal for something like this. I'm developing it locally. I don't want to have to buy a VPS to work with it. I have space on other servers in my apartment, but of course those, take up a lot more energy than I would like, especially for something like this. So I can basically build my own images, run them with Docker Compose, see how they're doing, make changes, restart the container, and see things pretty immediately, which is nice, especially something like this, like a text adventure game. You kind of have to tinker with it a lot to get it to work.
Like, what does it fix? Going to the containerized TTYD solves for you working on the game.
And for me, just kind of systemizing it a little bit, or systematizing it rather, so that I can be guaranteed that the image is always going to be the same, right? And if I have to rebuild the image, it doesn't take a long time to do. I'm almost done with the first level and pretty much start building another image at that point. I can shoot it to Docker Hub in case people want to try it. I haven't pushed it to GitHub yet, but I do have it set up for Git right now. So I'm still getting all the versioning and everything. Just makes it easier for me to test things. And I can kind of think that's like one of the big reasons why I started to like Docker a lot.
And as part of developing it, do you find yourself running like a number of different iterations of it via containers at a given time?
Yeah, I'm changing it all the time. But the thing that makes it easy, as you know, with Docker Compose, I basically just have to restart the container as I'm going along. So I'm working in the Python code. If I need to make a change, I can rebuild the image pretty fast because it's so minimal. There's really not anything in there except for TTYD. I did my best to kind of avoid too many dependencies if I could, so I didn't import a lot of libraries. It's a really simple game anyway, so it's mostly text, and since it's shell, it's pretty basic on its own.
Doesn't Python already offer some virtualization options with virtual environments and such? Is that kind of redundant in terms of Docker as well, or is it just something you're more comfortable with, or can you speak to that?
Well, it could be redundant in that sense, but I don't really have to virtualize it inside of a Docker container. But while I'm testing it, keeping my system clean is important to me because it can get really messy after a while. So I am comfortable with using virtual environments with Python now, as far as like staying organized, not corrupting my system in any way. I don't want to have a bunch of stuff going on, getting installed globally that's causing conflicts. It's in a similar way, virtualizing something like that in a virtual environment. I'm not going to say it's the same because someone will beat me up. Definitely the philosophy is similar, to kind of keep things contained, organized, and to avoid conflicts, minimize dependencies. Yeah, all those things I think are great.
Obviously, you have this project, which is great. When does it make sense for someone to try out containers?
I was running everything on bare metal for a long time, and partly I was kind of intimidated by Docker in a lot of ways because I didn't really understand it. I watched a lot of videos on YouTube about it and started to understand it's not that confusing, it's not that complex. Everybody can give it a shot at least, but I think it's the right time. There's no real penalty for trying, containers. For me, yeah, I just thinking about the bare metal days, like I know some people prefer that and I understand that. And there was a time when I did as well. But I can think of at least one situation where I'm running a VPS, paying for the VPS. It's, not anywhere near where I'm at. So the lag time is already bad. And I'm running a program bare metal that's having a lot of issues. And I have to restart the VPS over and over to get it to run correctly. And that kind of troubleshooting to me, even as someone who does this for fun, I don't work for a tech company. I can honestly say that moving to containers allowed me to run services on very minimal hardware. So I've got a Intel NUC for example, that's just sitting on my fireplace. And that was my first real server in the house. And having that, I was able to, spin up Portainer and manage my containers and run all kinds of services, try them out. If I didn't like them, I could just nuke them pretty easily. So that was, I think, one of the first times that I really started to try it out, was mostly as a learning thing. And I think that that's probably one of the better things. If people are working professionally in the tech field, it's just something you're going to have to know whether you like it or not. I hate to say that, but that's probably the truth.
Yeah, that's fair. I guess my question to you in terms of that too is, if you're running containers, in Docker or in Podman, doesn't matter, there's the option to basically run a container. So you get a Docker file, we'll say, onto the file system, and then you execute that with a Docker run command or with a compose file, either one, and then the service will start up. So let's say you're running like Calibre Web, the ebook tool. So you run it. It doesn't matter if it's on ARM or AMD, it's supported. It spins up, and then you get this service running on your local host domain, on your local network, that you can play around with. And do you think when someone does that it's better to use a compose file versus a run command? Or I'm just curious what you think in terms of using a tool like Portainer for management. How do you recommend that for someone, especially getting started?
I would recommend that they understand how Docker Run works. To me, it feels a lot like Bash scripting. It's pretty similar. But I would say that for me anyway, Docker Compose is a lot cleaner way to do it. I'm just going to say that. Primarily, I like to keep my stuff organized. So I have, a folder on whatever system I'm working with that has all of the Docker Compose files, and any data or whatever is in the same container as the Docker Compose file, related to that service. And, especially just being able to restart containers pretty easily. It's just really a nice thing to be able to do. So I feel like Docker Compose, it's a little intimidating to people, and at first, because YAML is a bit picky sometimes about syntax and things like that, indents and whatnot. I could probably send you a Docker Compose file right now, for example, that has everything set up, and you could reproduce the setup that I have. That's pretty amazing to me. So yeah, I always opt for the cleaner option. Just because I like to keep track of where things are, what they're doing. And yeah, kind of an extension of what I said about, using Portainer. Not that that's the only one that you can use to monitor stuff. Certainly, it's nice to be able to see, oh, this container's down. Why? I can restart it now and see what's going on. Or I can check the logs immediately in this UI. Convenience features like that. It's pretty nice to be able to do that just for the sake of being able to read something instead of looking at it in a terminal and it's like 200 lines of log files or something. That's just how I feel about it.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So for me personally, I really embraced Docker some years ago in testing for NextcloudPi. Right, which I'm running, was running, I think, originally on like a Pi 2 or something like that. And I was running it, and I was kind of turned off by the regular image, which was what people would normally use, like this all-in-one image Debian system that you would install on the device, right? Covering the whole length of the device. But I was doing testing, so I wanted to be the ability to start and stop it a lot and try different iterations, because I was trying to write documentation and such. So because of that, I moved to Docker for the same reason of even on a low-level device. It worked fine to have not only my production instance, but then little testing instances that I could spin up to, test updates and things like that and provide documentation and file GitHub issues. And that worked really well for me. Even as the hardware changed, kept using these Docker images and, just migrating them over.
When you mentioned having to deal with a full-size Debian image, I think that's one of the appeals of using Docker in the first place, is that you get to choose what's on the image. You can use Alpine, something that's incredibly minimal, to run an application the performance of it will be very noticeable. At least to me, I've run a bunch of these things over the last years, and it's just unreal how fast something will come up. But also that kind of flexibility, like you said, right? You don't want to deal with this huge Debian image. So I have an example of this. It's actually on my Docker Hub right now. Comfy UI is an AI program that I've been using a lot lately. It's for images. So they're AI generated images, and it's really an amazing piece of software, to be honest. I mean, I don't work for them or anything, but I think that their stuff is really great. But anyway, I took the repository and I put it on my computer, and I built a Docker image around that so that I could use that in a stack that I was building for AI, which is called the Ultimate Bacon Cheeseburger stack. And essentially, it's a bunch of AI services that I like to use. So I didn't have an image, which is the point here. I didn't have an image that I could use for Docker for Comfy UI. So I did go ahead and just build one. And it worked just fine. Actually, it worked a lot better for me because, if I go and run Docker Compose down and Docker Compose up for some other reason, right, it's working just fine every time. And that's pretty great. And also, I was able to have those folders, we talked about mounts and things like that, where all of my images that I generated, they're stored right on my computer. Of course, I could do that with their Python program as well, but to me, it's just a lot cleaner. Like I said, I favor that. I'm sure Model Context Protocol, things like that have been pretty popular lately. I was able to build my own MCP image, LLM stuff I was doing, and integrate that with OpenWebUI and my Obsidian notes, which there actually wasn't a real clear tutorial for that anywhere, but I was able to actually get it working, which is kind of a shocker. But those are the kind of things that I would like to highlight, at least, is that you have the ability to kind of take these open source repos and, make your own images, and that can be really useful for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, definitely. You're reminding me too, I'm reminded of why I migrated to Compose files. And I realized that there's two different reasons, which you also connect into. So one is running Docker run is also, to me, did not feel clean because I would be like, what did I do? And so I would export my history, my bash history, into a file so I could look at it later. And that felt weird. I mean, I still do it, but I wanted to be really clear of like how I run Docker. And I guess when you run Docker at the simplest level, what you're doing is you're doing Docker run, and then you're defining some variables. So you're defining like environment variables, possibly, let's say your time zone, permissions, and the mount location where the data lives as a command. And you type that out along with what image you're using. So say it's Calibre Web /Calibre Web connected to their GitHub or something. And then the service spins up from there. And so let's say something changes, the image location changes, anything changes, and you're trying to update or whatever in the future. For me, I got confused because I was like, what command did I run? And so then I'm going back through the history and I'm like, this is awkward. And I thought, I don't want to do it this way. So because of that, I went over to Compose. And Compose is just a compose.yaml file. And it's the same basic thing. You're executing a command. It's just broken out syntactically. It's the same command. And there's a great tool that I've liked over the years called Composerize. It's a website. And you just throw a run command and it turns it into a compose file. And then what you end up doing, I feel like this is what you end up doing with Docker anyway. The beauty of Docker is you can edit things. So the compose file, you can edit the compose file, and then you just have, a directory on the file system. Let's say, home/myuser/compose. And each time you have a new compose file, for me anyway, I just make a subdirectory, call it, Calibre Web. In that, I make my compose.yaml, and that's where I paste the same basic thing. It's just instead of Docker run, it has it laid out line by line of saying, these are my environment variables, this is my time zone, this is the image I'm using, this is the version. You can be as specific as you want, but also this is where the data lives. And that way, anytime I'm confused, I can go back to that exact file. And if I iterate on that file, I can always back it up. So I can do like a backup of my compose file as is, which I always do. before I edit it and make any changes. Because like you said, if you edit a compose file and it fails, it's very binary. It's like, it didn't work. And then you might have to just go back to what you had written there before or whatever. But it makes it really easy to keep track of what the heck you're doing and to iterate in that way. So once I changed to compose files, that was just for testing NextcloudPi even. I've never gone back. And it scales really easily too. And where that connects is you and I worked on services for Noisebridge together. And that was all done in shared compose files connected to a reverse proxy on a VPS. And that worked great. And there was like, what, half dozen people dinking around on it at a time. And it worked really well, right? We just paid for a VPS upfront for a few years and everyone edited it together using compose files and it worked great. So it definitely is like, I would not want to run Docker run commands, in like any kind of shared environment or even for myself. So yeah, I find compose files super duper helpful personally.
Yeah, we're on the same page for that. Exactly. Because just being able to find what you put in the YAML file is a huge benefit over, Docker run where you're checking your history is exactly what I was doing. Like, hey, what did I do? And then running Docker PS, is this thing even up? Trying to figure things out. It's a little bit more tedious than it needs to be. Having a Docker Compose file, you see people post them all the time. There's, awesome Docker Compose, for example, on GitHub, and you can just see other people's files and try them out. That's just really cool that you can do that.
And it just makes it easier to like understand what's happening within the container. It takes a moment to wrap your brain around, and like it does, because it's like living in the Matrix or something. Like you're spinning up an ephemeral container within your system, right? And so it's this ephemeral container within your system. It's there, but for example, you might have to issue a command through Docker in order to issue a command directly within that container. If you wanted to do something to it in the ephemeral state, you could enter it with exec -it, and you could do a bin bash session and actually go inside the container. If for some reason you wanted to do that and you wanted to enter the container, you could. And I think that idea is something that people find very confusing. You can totally do it, but end of the day, what you want is you want to control things previous to that at the compose at the run level of executing the container and having it already in the state that you want, if that makes sense. So it's giving you flexibility in how you mess with a service. And the more you iterate on something, to my opinion, the more useful containers become.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't always use them. Like I just wrote I think I mentioned to you, I wrote a video rendering program, and that's just bare Python in a folder. Actually, it's on GitHub too. I didn't feel any need to containerize that one. So I think there's sometimes where it's maybe you just don't need to do it. Certainly for like web applications and other services, it's like really, really nice to have, something that's lean. Like I mentioned, a lot of my first services that I ran were running on an Intel NUC. It does not have that many resources, but because of the fact that I'm using very minimal container images, I'm able to actually get a lot of work done on it. Kind of surprising, to be honest. Like I didn't think that it would be able to handle it, but it's been doing fine. I've had zero downtime in the last couple of months, and I haven't had to do a lot of work to maintain that. So it's pretty nice.
Yeah, totally. In a similar vein, like I've had my compose files running for a number of years, and they just keep going, and I have them set to auto restart. Unless I personally shut them down, they just bop back up. So if the power goes off and the power comes back on, they just spin back up again and continue on as normal. When I'm using Docker, because I have compose files and I have clear notes too of what I've changed, what I've done, I can review those, even the compose files themselves, and I know what the service is. Like I know what version of the software I'm running. I know where the data lives, so I can get access to it when I need it, and I can pick up where I left off. And so for me, I haven't actually needed any kind of further maintenance tool. So I tried Portainer, for example, and I don't need it because I can just look at the compose file, or I just execute docker psa, and that tells me what services are running or the last time they were offline. And that gives me enough information to know if something's wrong. So all I need to do is use the basic, bare bones command, the ps command, to list what's running and what's not, and I know what's wrong with the system. And I don't need any further real monitoring beyond that because everything just continues in a functional state. So this is another thing about Docker that, I love. Oh, and so when I recorded with Robin mentioned Calibre Web has added a bunch of new AI features and he's frustrated about it. But I realized I haven't updated my Calibre Web in some time, so that hasn't happened to me yet. I haven't encountered any of that. But the tool is also running fine, so that's why I just kind of didn't think about updating it because I'm just running it internally. But I like that about Docker.
There's a lot of stability in that, and like you mentioned, if there are features that people don't like, there's always that version of the image that can be reproduced. Especially when I mentioned the Comfy UI image that I made, there's nothing on there that I don't like, but it's stable. It works. It's been working. It's not the newest version either, but it works. So, I can go and pull from the repository again, build a new image and have their latest image if I want, or I can not do it. Because the thing with the Docker is that you have all the code in a working state. It's reproducible. So you do have that benefit for sure. And I think that's a big one.
Yeah, that's a big one. And another big one, just to put it in perspective too, of experimenting with services, is a really easy way, common way to use something like Docker is you spin up a container, and as part of that, you can assign a basically virtualized network within Docker. And so let's say we call it My Big Network. So you can attach My Big Network to multiple containers, which can include things like reverse proxy or whatever. And that way you can connect all your services that you've defined together into the same network automatically, like they can see each other, which is so useful. These are ways these tools are so useful. It's like, I want the data in this directory. Let's say in my Jellyfin server, I want that to be seen by my Aria downloader app, which is downloading files. I want to watch into that directory. And I want both of these programs accessible to a reverse proxy. And it's like, boom, it's done. So the way you can connect any number of services together within containers is awesome. Because if you can do it with 3, you can do it with 30. And that part of it is really cool too. And that's something where I am not sure, I'm not as comfortable doing that without containers personally, because I can do so many iterations across any number of containers, which is super handy. All even within the same compose file if I want.
Yeah, absolutely. The AI stack that I mentioned is all on a network called AINet. And so I know that, those containers are all able to talk to each other, which they do actually have to do. So the MCP container, for example, has to be able to reach the Open WebUI, and Comfy also has to be able to reach Open WebUI. And there's some other stuff on there that needs to reach other services. So that's another way to keep things neat, is to have those networks isolated. And certainly, I have other virtual networks as well for other services. So it's just altogether, nice to be able to tie things together, and kind of, reminds me also with working with some larger stacks in Compose, it's just kind of crazy that you can bring, all of these services up and down in a matter of, seconds sometimes.
Absolutely. Another thing that I've noted personally in running containers, coming from NextcloudPi especially, is like a tool like Nextcloud, which has so many different components, right? It's got the web server, the database, all these different parts. That's basically the most complicated thing you could possibly run. And most things are much, much simpler in terms of what is required as far as different components. And so what I've found is it's easier to run 40, random services than it is to run something like Nextcloud that has so many needs in terms of how it's set up. It has so many configuration things, which is why NextcloudPi exists, right? That offers the whole Debian stack as part of it. It's just so complex. But in general, I found containers are very, very simple. And I like that about it. It's a lot to wrap your head around, I think, like in terms of abstracting a hardware layer into software. But it's also not a horribly scary thing. And I think if you're starting with something like Nextcloud, you're making it as hard as it could basically be. And if you try other tools that are simpler, it's pretty painless.
Yeah, I mean, I can think of at least one service that would be a nice one for people to test is Etherpad. It's probably the most painless thing to set up. It's pretty much ready to go as soon as you put the container up, or at least that's been my experience anyway. So that one's pretty simple.
Yeah, totally. Like you just can basically spin up the service on localhost and then just access it on your local network, with a IP address and maybe a port number, and that's it. And then because you're using a container, you can also redefine things like what the port number is, which is also very useful directly in the container. You could be like, oh, for some reason, this port's not available. I'm going to write my own. And I think this is where containers become so useful is like you can define something that makes sense to you personally, and it doesn't have to make sense to like the broader world. It's nice.
Testing locally too is really, fun thing to be able to do because there's so little pressure. And I think even with Docker makes it even better because, like you said, a lot of it is ephemeral. You can change the image however you want. If you write some new code, you can, update the image and try it again. You can test it on your local network. You could even have people that are on your local network test it out too if they want to try it. I mean, it's pretty ideal. You don't have to send something out into the larger web just to try it or whatever. It just makes a lot more sense. Less DNS issues.
Interesting note. I'll try to find the article to add in here, but I saw that there was recently, I don't know if it was, basically there was a look over of all the different images that have been posted related to containers. And so many of them include like personal information that shouldn't be listed. People defining basically passwords and things like as variables in their image and then posting that to GitHub or whatever. Anyway, it's interesting. Apparently there was like many of them, like tens of thousands or more images that were leaking credentials.
Yeah, that's definitely a problem. Docker has secrets. If you aren't aware of that, you can go to the documentation and look at that, or just something as simple as using a .env file, env, or just being aware of the fact that you shouldn't be putting passwords in your, especially in your GitHub repositories. There's lots of ways to protect your information, and you should definitely be doing that because guess what? Hackers are looking for that stuff on the repos. There's specific, I'm just going to do a security preachy bit here. There's plenty of Google dorks that are specifically for looking for credentials on GitHub.
Yeah, absolutely. And what HB is referring to is anything that you type into Docker when you're running a command, there's no reason that you actually have to keep reiterating the same information. For example, like it doesn't have to just be a password or something. It could be like your time zone. You can create a environment variable as a file and you could call it, say, time zone or, like user permissions. And then you can define your user group permissions for your containers there. And then instead of handwriting it every time, you just say, I want this container to look at user permissions.env, and that's where it'll pull this information from automatically. And you can use that across a number of different containers. But these are ways to also maintain credentials and stuff, so you're not actually writing them in the container. You're just saying, look to this file, which then if you shared it online, the person doesn't have access to that file, so they don't get that information.
And make sure you're checking your git.ignore file, your .git.ignore file. If you don't know what that is, look it up. It'll basically keep your files from getting pushed to GitHub. So definitely if you had a bunch of passwords in there, you don't want that getting pushed over there. So it's one of the ways you avoid that. And like the environmental variables too, if you're pushing a repo out for people to use, just include in your documentation, like, hey, here's the variables that you need to set up yourself with your own information, instead of, leaking anything that you don't need to.
And a reason why you would share this kind of information, if you're like, why I wouldn't do that? Well, one reason that you would want to share container information is it makes it so easy to problem solve. Because if you're, say everyone's using the same, Docker image, that's what we call an image that's then spinning up the container. If you've defined anything, you can always share that, like in a paste bin, or it doesn't have to be on GitHub, in order to get people to help understand, if you'd written something wrong in the command. It's like, oh, it's not working anymore. And you can share that. And then the person can give you feedback like, oh, the maintainer changed. Everything you wrote is correct. It's just the actual image link you've written in here is now incorrect. Something like that, So there's reasons to share this more universally with people as you use it and you get comfortable with it. You just want to be careful, that you're not leaking information. Do you want to respond to some of these people's comments in regards to sticking with bare metal?
Do you want me to?
Sure. I mean, did any jump out at you? So I asked people on Lemmy what they thought, who are sticking with bare metal, as we call it, as using the machine itself to run a service. And they're not doing containers by choice. And I was curious why that is. Not in a judgy way, just like literally like, why are people just, as of 2025, now 2026, sticking with not using containers? Like, what about it makes them like, no thanks? The number one answer, which makes sense, is that people are just happy with what they're running. And I think that's true universally. Like, if you're using something, it's working, it makes sense. You don't need to like mess with your recipe, If it's in production, yeah, why mess with it? I get that. And I think a lot of answers are related to that, It's like more just the old school, I'm already doing it, so I don't care. Which makes sense. Like this person says, to me, Docker is an abstraction layer that I don't need. Oh, but this person says, I do like VMs and Proxmox and LXC. All right, so whatever. I don't have the time to learn Docker and K8, but I am using virtual machines and Proxmox. So, I mean, whatever. There's some virtualization happening there.
Yeah, I think there's varied opinions on them. You definitely have some people who are, I guess we could say a little more old school, who've been doing things for a long time, and they're probably professionals in this field, and so they are comfortable, working with bare metal, which, there's nothing wrong with that either. And I think the larger point probably is that you have choices. Like Docker's not the only choice. You can use whatever you want, even just thinking about virtual machines. I think we talked about that a little bit. I don't like VirtualBox. I'll go on record saying that I do not enjoy using it. I do like VMware, which some people hate, but guess what? I like it, and that's my choice. So I had choices between those two, but additionally, QEMU, is that how you say it? I think that's how you say it. Whatever. Anyway, I like that. Like I have scripts on my machine right now that I can just bring up a Parrot OS, instance. I can also recently, just out of weird curiosity from watching a couple weird YouTube videos, put a QEMU script that I brought up Temple OS, just to see what was going on with that. And, I think that it just depends on what you want to use, I like containers for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes, like I said, I make things that I don't feel the need to containerize. But overall, I don't see why people wouldn't want to use them or at least try them. There's certainly a lot of benefits, but, everybody likes the things that they like, and, I'm not here to tell them any different.
Yeah. Like here's a person's comment, says, I've done it both ways. At this point, I would not go back to bare metal because I find myself encountering dependency hell.
Dependency hell.
Yes, that's the way they describe it. Dependency hell, like over time.
I can agree with them on that.
Yeah, but like here's a different one. Says, I don't want to add any additional overhead or complexity to my system because I'm already comfortable with it. I see legitimate use cases for Docker and work purposes where we use virtual machines constantly. I just don't want to benefit from that in my home, which also makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, you've got so much liberty when you're working in a home lab, and that's like the big draw, I think, for a lot of people is you can do whatever you want. Like, I'm sure folks who work in, the tech industry professionally, there's a lot of constraints. Sometimes they get pushed to do things that they don't want to do. They're using products that they don't want to use. But at home, you can pretty much do whatever you want. For me, I won't say that I have a low spec setup over here because I do have some powerful machines now. The ones that I primarily use are much lower spec, and I get a lot more done because I'm using Docker on these machines. Otherwise, I would not be able to accomplish as much as I do.
Yeah, makes sense. I mean, like here's another person that says, all of my services run on bare metal. It's easy. The backups are working. I have a simplified workflow. I don't have to worry about things like virtualized routing. It's a very tiny system, but I am able to run a number of services, peer-to-peer, GoToSocial, search engine, custom sites, backups, matrix, and a whole lot more without a single container. And it's using less RAM and doing a DD once in a while keeps everything as it should be. It's been going for 4 years-ish. It works great. I used to overcomplicate everything with Docker and Compose files, but I would have to keep up with those underlying changes all the time, which in my opinion sucked, and it's not something that I care to do with my weekend. And it says, keep in mind, I do use Docker, Kubernetes, etc. at work. It's great when you have those resources and other people to help keep things up to date, but I just want to relax. It's not the end of the world.
Yeah, I totally get that. And that sounds like what I said earlier, like at work, you got, at your disposal, you could have hundreds of people working on a project. There's no telling what that situation might look like, but it's distributed work, stress as well. So yeah, if you're at home and you want to just relax and play with things and have fun, and things are already working, kind of a, if it ain't broke, don't fix it situation.
Yeah. And to your point too, the beauty of trying any sort of containers is like, you don't have to hurt yourself doing it either. Like there's nothing wrong with literally spinning something up to test it and then making it go away, which is by design how it works. That's the good news. If you're already running services and you're curious, you can just spin something up for the purpose of testing and spin it down. I'll link to this long discussion thread of people's thoughts, and everyone's entitled to their opinion. It's totally fine. And I was really curious about it, and personally, I have been using containers for a long time. But it's just something like anything; it just takes time to get used to or to wrap your brain around. But it is like an industry standard that's heavily used, so definitely worth knowing. I would say it's not, it's worth being aware of for sure. Especially if you want to run multiple things simultaneously. Well, I think that's good on that. Yeah. Anything you have coming up you want people to be aware of?
Just, check out my GitHub if you get the chance. It's just github.com, Hungry Bogart, which actually it's Hungry-Bogart. And you can see some of my projects. Most recently, the Mermaids, A Secret Journey. Hope you like this text adventure.